this House is that this House believes that the free trade agreements should also include free labor movements. Let's begin with calling upon the Prime Minister to open the case.
So, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. I guess the reason that we are debating this motion is that we are under the same assumption that free trade agreement is good for those countries who agree to these agreements. With that well said, what we are proposing here is that in this free trade agreement framework, we should include the free labor movement, which is now lacked in the current status quo in most countries who are involved in free trade agreement. So we realize that cooperation is better in this globalized era. We realize the countries can play their advantages better and avoid their weakness by cooperating with other countries. So we kind of want to share resources. We kind of want to lower the barriers for trade so that the resources can be better relocated, and also economies of those countries that are involved in the agreement would grow better. But now what we are having here is that we still have limits to the labor movement. What kind of limits? We have limits about how many workers can go to another country to work for a specific job. We have how much time you could work for a specific job. We have those working visas, and also we have in most countries that the person who comes to another country should always work for the job that they sign a contract to, which means they are subject to the company that they work for if they want to stay in that country. All those limits would actually hinder the labor movement and also hinder the spirit of free trade in itself, which is not going to be helpful for both countries and also for the economic growth and other things in the whole international world as a whole, which is why we want to propose this motion. We want to lower those limits. In which sense this is going to be our policy? We want to get rid of the two-tier system that we have now. We want the people who come to work for a foreign country enjoy the same welfare, the same rights that the employees of that country enjoy, so that they would have, and also they are not restricted to the job that they came to the country in the first place. In which case, they will enjoy welfare, they will enjoy the rights that they should enjoy, though the free movement of labor is going to be realized in our model. So why would we want that? We want the equity of labor in any country that's involved in agreement. In our circumstances, there is, in this whole situation of globalization, only 1% of the people is benefited from the model, which is the people who are richer, the people who enjoy more resources, so that they can somehow abuse the labor, so they can offer a lower than average, but still get labor who can work for them, which is like the major incentive for them to hire foreign labor. But what we want is we want to increase competition among the companies. We want them to hire, to improve their welfare and that they provide to their employees, so that there will be more competition among the companies for really talented people. And your point?
So there's going to be no visa scheme, control in the firm, or job ground checks. There's going to be nothing.
What we are talking about here is that if the free trade agreement is already existing there, in particular industry, in particular involved countries. So there will be there won't be any restriction as to the number or as to what kind of job they have to work for. In that sense, the visa or if the application of visa fall under our model, then it's abolished. What we want is that with the increase of competition among the companies, there will be better living standard for any labor. Therefore, there will be more free movement. And especially when we see that Silicon Valley is trying to hire more foreign talents from all over the world, they can't do it because of so many limits existing in our system right now, which is why it is not going to be a good drive for all the technological innovation, and which is why if we consider them as a great drive for the whole world's innovation, it is not going to be good, not only for America, not only for the US, it's not going to be good for the whole globe as to what we want to improve and what we want to do better. Let's come back to the point that why this is going to help to increase welfare for the companies, and also why it's going to increase because the employees will have more leverage to bargain, to negotiate, because they don't have to subject to the contract that they signed for initially, so that they can talk to the employees about promotion opportunities. But in our current situation, they can't, because they have to work for that job for a very long time. And they go back, they won't have another chance, because there's no free competition in the market anyway. So once they got the job, they have to stick to that. That's what's happening right now, which is why we think it's not right, it's not like coherent to the spirit of free market. What we want is that the companies fighting more for better talents and providing higher standards and rights and welfare for the employees, and the employees have the free choice as to what kind of job they want to work for. So in our circumstance, in the model and in the policy that we provide, we would say that cooperation and competition is better promoted in our model, and also it's not going to be like imposing our FTA on any country who do not want to be involved in this. It's only going to be carried out between or among the countries who want to be involved in FTA, and it's still coherent to the stipulation that's already in the FTA. In which case, we think labor is one kind of resources. Since we promote the idea of free trade, if we need to do resources, why not labor movement? So, in which case, we are very proud to propose.
2 minutes and 9 seconds.
So, opening government had a problem-solution mismatch, right? So the problem was we have bipolarization in society, but we can solve that through FTA and through free labor movement and actually increasing labor mobility. We think that this premise is very much flawed. They didn't actually give us the logical linkages and how we actually solve bipolarization at the end of the day. I'm going to prove that in my refutations and then move on to our substantive case. Now, first of all, rebuttals. Now, first of all, they said, okay, 1% benefit from the whole society current model, and they can abuse laborers, cheap laborers. So we can actually have a free competition and we increase the quality of laborers. But the problem is, Mr. Speaker, just because the quality goes up doesn't mean that they pay them more. Just because okay, maybe the quality might increase, but the labor is going to come cheaper and cheaper because this kind of influx of cheap labor from developed nations and developing nations to developed nations is going to cause a loss of jobs in the local labor market in the first place, and second of all, the labor is going to become even cheaper. So we think that it doesn't, the flow of the money, the redistribution of wealth is not necessarily going to happen. But second of all, we think that the premise is that the local labor market, it doesn't have a chance to compete because they have a certain standards of living because their expectations of lives actually are higher than the developing nations, meaning that they actually want more wages and demand more wages. So they're not going to take like the cheap jobs. They're not going to be like hamburger flippers at the end of the day. So we think that this kind of problem doesn't it actually creates more problems at the end of the day. Thank you. Second of all, second rebuttal. They say, I didn't know why this was an argument. They said that you stay too long in one job and we don't have job like mobility, so why is this a problem? Second of all, we think that it actually causes more problem because it's inefficient. You have to, we think that this mobility, unnecessary mobility in jobs means that you have to hire workers again and again, meaning that you have to train them again and again, and it increases the training costs and actually creates even more harms to the corporation. And second of all, we think it was an active choice for these laborers in the first place. So we think that it doesn't necessarily have a problem. So we think that they actually have to clarify what necessarily their stance is and actually provide mechanisms and how they're going to solve their problem. We think that Prime Minister failed to do this, and that's why opening opposition has an upper hand in the first place in 3 minutes of my speech. But we think that, second of all, we think that this motion is actually about how FTA has to benefit both parties and actually having the addition of labor movement, actually have labor mobility, will actually benefit both developed nations and developing nations, and also both parties in the agreement. We're going to tell you specifically why. In the context of labor, this is not going to happen because we give you the characteristics that labor is not just an economic asset, but labor is actually like humans. They actually contribute to society. It's not. They actually are members of the community. They actually interact with other members of society, and therefore actually have more external, more externalities at the end of the day. We think that it's going to actually have a pernicious effect. So first of all, I'm going to divide my argumentations into 3 ways. First of all, I'm going to talk about how actually harms developed nations. And second of all, I'm going to talk about how it actually harms developing nations. Third of all, I'm going to talk about how it actually creates a dichotomy and the anti-sentiment towards developing nations at the end of the day. So before we move on, yes, quickly.
Yeah, so you are for protectionism in this case. If you're talking about whether it's beneficial for one country and that involved.
No. We think that FTA actually brings benefits to both parties, but when it comes to specifically to the context of labor, this doesn't happen. I'm going to prove that. Please listen to my speech. First of all, we think that when it comes to free labor movement in the FTA, there is also obviously going to be a developed nation and developing nation in the agreement, or either a developed nation and a more developed nation. Meaning that there's going to be either one nation that has an upper hand when it comes to minimum wage, living standards, or all these kinds of standards when it comes to labor. What happens here is that the local labor is not going to have a chance to compete against the foreign labor because comparing the quality, these developing nations labor, when they come to developed countries, they're actually going to have more. They're going to provide labor for a cheaper standard, Mr. Speaker. So we think that actually shifts the money going to the local labor to the foreign labor. Why is this bad? We think that actually has 3 effects. First of all, we think that actually increases unemployment in the local community, which actually increases the government burden and actually increases government expenditure on welfare, social welfare, meaning that actually has a harm on the economy as well because now they don't have enough government budget to use elsewhere. Second of all, we think that money will also be drained out of the country because their families and friends are going to still be in their home nation, but they're going to send money back again, through international banks or whatnot. And this currency is not going to circulate within the domestic market, and therefore it's going to lower the GDP and actually lower also the economic transactions that happen, meaning that we actually have a less stimulated market at the end of the day. We think this is harm. Thirdly, we think that it's actually the locals that live there and perpetually live in that market, and live in that society that actually contribute back to society because they feel that have been benefited by that society, actually have a total affiliation to that society. But these foreign laborers are not going to have that kind of affiliation, and therefore they're not going to actually have the fullest extent of affiliation and benefit back to the society. Oh, I'm running out of time. Second of all, we think that it actually harms developing nations because now it actually incentivizes these cheap laborers in developing nations to actually move to developed nations, meaning that there's going to be significant loss in labor in developing nations. What does this mean? It means that it actually less incentivizes the government, the developing nations government to actually solve their employment problems and solve the problems within their own nation, which means that these problems are going to still sustain and be instilled in that society, not being unsolved. We think that it's a completely irresponsible for these kind of developed nations governments to actually say, if you don't have a job in our nation, just go to like America, go to like better places that have a higher minimum wage. We think that this is bad because first of all, it actually brings brain drainage because when they actually get educated, when they bring their families to other like countries, in the cases that they do, then they're actually going to be more affiliated to the society, and that's what happened to like us in South Korea, right? We actually send our families to the United States of America, and they just stayed there, and we're going to have a significant loss of talent, significant loss of labor, significant loss of also like economic cost of these people as well. So we think that actually there's a net harm at the end of the day. So when it's specifically comes to labor, it shouldn't be free. The free movement shouldn't be instilled in the FTA because it's very much harmful. That's why we're very much harmful.
Thank you very much. I'd like to call upon the Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the opposition is mired in a past paradigm where nation-states drew firm boundaries between each other, and we believe that paradigm is unsustainable in a modern era. We think if you want the advantages of free trade in goods and services, which we all do, we also have to add the advantages of labor as well, because to have a true free market, you can't just have one sector have free exchange of goods and services. That actually paralyzes the market. It means things are not allocated efficiently. Instead, you also have to have labor moving freely so that the most talented labor or the labor with a comparative advantage moves where it is most needed. So before I get into specific rebuttal, I'd simply like to take a case of two contrasting examples in the United States to show why our basic stance is correct, that not just for equity, but also for economic growth, you can't keep trying to sustain unnaturally high wages or unnaturally high local employment in one industry, which is basically going to be a dying industry in your country because you have no comparative advantage. I'm going to look at the example of the U.S. steel industry versus the example of U.S. farming industry. Steel industry, which has been extremely protectionist, even to the extent where several presidents have violated WTA orders as long as they could dig in their heels, and not allowed any competition in labor, not allowed even any free trade, giving subsidies to their own local steel industry or giving preference to local steel contractors, has slowly eroded in the United States over time because it's protectionist, because it can't compete on price or on quality or any other level, because it's paying unsustainably high wages to its workers, and because it's operating under an uncompetitive environment. So the U.S. steel industry has dropped from, like in 1970, number 1, to number 2 after Japan, to number 3 after Japan and Korea, to number 4 after Japan, Korea, and China now. It's just not doing well. On the other hand, the farming industry, which although, no thank you, not right now, it's faced the problem of equity for its workers because it employs a lot of illegal immigrant workers, also employs a lot of legal immigrants, employs a lot of local citizens, and because it has low wages, and because it competes internationally, the U.S. farming industry has actually done really well. And the U.S. has other comparative advantages in those areas, like large amounts of land, which are good for farming. So the end result of our policy will not only be good for equity, as the Prime Minister said, but will also be good globally for international competition and for delivering more and more efficient goods and services to everyone around the world, which is the whole purpose of globalization and the free market. We think we have a win-win situation where by removing these barriers, which are somewhat unnatural barriers, we not only give in the short term the abused workers on like 2-tier contracts or on limited times or on slave contracts where they can't leave the job better equity and better negotiating power, but also we think in the long term this is going to be good for industries Our stance is that the only thing holding this back is that certain privileged rich people who have put in their investments in certain uncompetitive industries are resisting it, and we think it has to go. We also think that the selfish attitude of like, well, but this would be bad for this specific industry in this country, or well, it would be bad for Korea because, you know, Korea only manages to export like its farm products or its like chemical industry because it employs foreign workers in a dirty, dangerous, and low-paying job. We think the Korean chemical industry has to go in the long term, and we don't think that's the future of Korea. Why not? Closing.
So why would any sane country agree to your proposal that actually harms their heavily invested very
Thank you.
industry?
Because they want the trade in goods and services as well. And we don't actually have to prove that any country would actually pass this, right? We have to prove that this would be better in the long term. We have to prove that it has a net advantage over status quo. We think we're proving those things. Okay, let me do a little bit of rebuttal, and then I'll go on to talk a little bit more about equity, a lot about the free market, and then a little bit about social welfare as well. Okay, first about moments of rebuttal. So, they claim that local people in the local market won't want to take the cheap jobs and compete. First of all, I'd like to note, as they even conceded at the end of the PM speech, we're not getting rid of minimum wage laws. We're not like lowering everything to a minimum like starvation wage standard where the iron law of wages kicks in. There's still going to be minimum wage, there's still going to be a living standard. We think if the local people don't want to take those dirty jobs and they'd rather invite people from foreign countries to take them under the same basic equity and minimum wage conditions, we think that's fine. It's their fault. They should suffer if they don't want to do the dirty job and they're holding out for like the job with Samsung, right? Like if you don't want to work in construction, but construction will feed your family, you'd rather import a Chinese worker, sorry, that's your problem. It's not the problem of the Chinese worker who actually, if they're willing to work hard, deserves that job. They say it's going to be bad for society because these people will not like fit in and contribute. Well, we think our model actually solves part of that problem because it gives them an incentive to integrate and fit in more because they have equal rights. They have the power to move from a slave employer, no thank you, who is abusing them, to just look for another job where somebody's offering a higher job. Okay, a little bit about equity then. First, there are both direct effects from having equal standards, but there are also indirect effects from negotiating power, as the Prime Minister said. And I'd just like to add, it's a huge investment for someone to leave their country based on their personal wealth, right? To leave their country and take a job in another country. They're basically stuck if they're in a bad state. That's why it's so important for them to have power to move from one job to another, have power to negotiate with their employer, have power to improve their state. It's a basic human right. Okay, on the free market and efficiency then. First of all, what about comparative advantage in dying industries? I just want to remind you of that point. That was my opening example. We think in the long term it's unsustainable and it's also worse for the world economy if we have inefficient industries being propped up by protectionist policies. Second, what about availability of skilled labor? Actually, the United States is slowly moving toward this kind of open labor policy. Europe has already conceded in terms of adding to the Schengen Agreement, an agreement on movement of labor. If someone has a job, they're freely able to move, they get all the equal rights and benefits, they can change their job, etc., etc. Why? Because at least for skilled workers, there's a huge demand for people coming in. Like Silicon Valley in the US can't even fill all its jobs with US graduates. Their problem of like people will be unemployed or local people will have resentment, totally not true, at least for skilled labor. For unskilled labor, we think it's also going to be good. Because right now we have a situation where, again, the barriers, the artificial barriers are keeping people out. That means people have to sneak in illegally. That means the employers can abuse them at a lower wage. If we have better competition where people can come in legally and work in those unskilled jobs, that means there's going to be more of a supply of legal workers. It's going to cut illegal immigration. It's going to cut the incentive for employers to abuse their employees. And in the end, we're going to have better employing. We're not going to need to retrain people because they're going to be happy with their jobs. They're going to stay there. It's a win-win situation. Short-term losers should lose in the short term. We go for the long term and the vision of reform. Thank you.
workers. So what are you saying? They should also fall so that you actually don't need FTA labor movement. So that's what he's actually saying. So get things straight. But Mr. Speaker, the thing is, we think exactly that's something that he's actually saying. Because just because of the sake of inefficient corporations, inefficient industries that are not able to keep up with the market trend and are not able to develop itself, they're just going to let go of restrictions of labor that actually protect its own people in necessary protections, Mr. Speaker. Because there are a lot of ways to actually make them develop that give them more resources for research and development, give them more resources for to develop more cost-efficient technologies. We don't see any reason why at the cost of your own domestic citizens, you have to get rid of the necessary protections, Mr. Speaker. But secondly, thank you, please sit down. But secondly, Mr. Speaker, also he says that it's more equal because these foreign laborers actually deserve these jobs because they work hard. No, Mr. Speaker, that's actually not happening in the status quo. Do we see Philippine people, do we see a lot of Southeast Asian people working in Korea just because they're working hard? No, Korean people work also very hard. The reason these people actually get more, they are actually prioritized within the Korean community is because they are cheap. And that's what all corporations all carry about. That is why we think that itself is actually very harmful to our domestic citizens, because now what they're doing is when Philippine citizens, or like, not Philippines, like any kind of, not in every like kind of cheap foreign labor say, oh, even though your minimum wage is manwon, I'm willing to work for you at 7,000 won. That itself makes your own citizens lower their bar of minimum wage. So we think that it's going to create a huge harm for your own society, where people are now going to be all going to corporations and going to be devaluing themselves by devaluing the minimum wage that they have, Mr. Speaker. Thank you. Mr. Speaker, let's actually recontextualize the debate, because they actually talked about how there is going to be not enough efficient and skilled workers just because we don't have a free labor system. But the thing is, not, Mr. Speaker. If even in the status quo, they actually contextualize the status quo as if we're not able to have any kind of movements about labor, because they are already considered that there are working visas. We're able to have people from foreign countries. The thing is, if Korea is able to afford to bring Steve Jobs to Korea, Korea is also going to give a loads of working visas to that Steve Jobs in order to bring him in. So we think in the status quo, already skilled workers, efficient workers from countries are actually being imported to your own domestic citizens. But the thing is, Mr. Speaker, it's about poor, it's about actually laborers who actually work in the basic assembly line, who do not actually give any kind of benefits to your own nations. This is what they're talking about. Because a lot of nations are not willing to give them work visas because they know it actually doesn't give any kind of benefits. So we think their benefits of innovation actually are already working in the status quo, and working already in the status quo, and just because they actually make a free labor movement does not actually entail that. How is this, Mr. Speaker? Because firstly, it's actually so they've also talked about how poor people come to our nations like Korea, they will be able to learn these kind of technologies and also bring it to their country. But the thing is, firstly, Mr. Speaker, we don't think these laborers are willing to go back into their developing nations. Why is this so? Because they actually came to the developed nations because they themselves wanted to be escaped from the developing nations. The only reason that in the status quo they go back is because of the limitations we actually have. They don't want to go back to a country where they were always poverty-stricken. They don't want to go to a country where there isn't even basic infrastructure. So why do you think they're even going to go back? But secondly, Mr. Speaker, the innovation that they're still talking about, how technology is going to be globalized. But that's actually happening where Samsung actually goes into another foreign country for cheap markets, and actually they train the domestic people in whatever country they're actually offshoring. But so all the benefits they talked about is a mutual
we'd like to clarify our goal as the government side. Our goal as a government, opposing government, is that we want efficient distribution of human resource all around the world, whether it be developing nations or developed nations. And then we believe that we cannot weigh the importance of intellectual resource or whether it be physical resource. We believe that according to certain countries like developing nations, they need intellectual property, whereas those developed nations actually need those kind of working resources, working people. Therefore, we believe that by analyzing, we're going to analyze to you in two levels as to intellectual labor, and then when it comes to intellectual labor, the developing nations are going to benefit without hurting the developed nations. And then secondly, it's going to give out physical labor to those developed nations who actually need those kind of labors without hurting the developing nations. Before we go into that, we're going to rebut to what the opening opposition has mentioned. Firstly, the opening opposition has mentioned two main arguments here. They talked about how it disturbs the economic flow and deteriorates the economic flow of the original, the exporting country, and then how it causes brain drain. Those are the two main arguments. First of all, regarding how it disturbs the economic flow of the country because people working in foreign lands give the money back to that country where they come from. But we believe that this is an assumption that the human resource is physical, and then but in the case of South Korea, for example, South Korea is a relatively developed country, and then we see that foreigners actually come to South Korea working as providing physical labor, and then they also give money back to their original country. But does that mean that South Korean economy is deteriorating? No, but because people in South Korea actually need this kind of physical labor because people avoid this kind of jobs. People don't want to work as those kind of physical labor involved jobs. Therefore, South Korea actually needs this kind of people, whether even if they were to give the money back to their original country, they still contribute to that original country, like South Korea. Therefore, we believe that their whole argument about how it disturbs economic flow, it may lower the profit as we have expected through this motion, but that doesn't mean we don't get benefit. And also, they talked about how there's anti-sentiment because there will be no profit. This goes out as well because the South Korea and the original country, whether it's like Philippines, whether it is from another country, they still contribute. Okay, moving on. Brain drain. They were talking about how the intellectuals actually go out. And then, however, we believe that just because the market becomes bigger, that doesn't mean that all the intellectuals goes all into another country, like the United States, for example, Mr. Speaker. Two levels of analysis. Firstly, because there will be expanded competition. It's not just going to be domestic competition, but through this policy, we're going to have these companies competing with all the foreign companies. With foreigners in competition, we're going to see the domestic companies will need intellectuals anyways. But what they're going to do is they're going to improve their working environment, they're going to improve their wages, they're going to improve the conditions that are going to be given to the workers. Therefore, we see that just because the domestic companies are going to improve their quality of their conditions in the companies, and then so the people are given the better choices actually, as people working, whether it be domestic because their conditions are going to be improved, whether it be foreign because they choose to go to a foreign country. So we believe that by lowering these barriers like taxes, we're just going to have providing more choices to the people who want to work, and then at the same time improving domestic companies' conditions. So when they worried about how there's going to be people are all going to the foreign country, it's not going to make sense. And the second level of analysis, we believe that
Sure. So you just consider the fact that a lot of the jobs that these people are trying to have are dangerous and deadly. How can you ensure that the Korean 사장님들 are going to ensure them a very favorable, nice environment for them?
How is intellectual property deadly, Mr. Speaker? We don't see. As we're talking about brain drain, we're not talking about physical, kind of working environment where it's it may harm the workers. When we talk about brain drain, we're talking about intellectual property, intellectual people going out to a foreign country to work. That's what they were concerned about. So we don't see any point in that POI anyways. And so moving on to our analysis regarding intellectual labor and the physical labor, we believe that when it comes to intellectual labor, we see that we're going to loan infrastructure, technology, and that it's going to basically, obviously, going to improve the developing countries, technology and the intellect, how they run those intellects, and then improve the nation in the long term, as the opening has already mentioned. And then we see that how it benefits developing nations. If the developing nations need brains, therefore it actually really, develops, benefits the developing nations. But because we cannot compare the importance of intellectual property and then the physical property, therefore we're saying that developing nations gaining this physical property, which is what they need, and then losing a bit of intellectual is not really that great of a loss as they have been stressing about. And then secondly, about physical labor, is that we believe that developed nations, they were worrying about how they're going to pay the workers less. And then the welfare is going to be lowered. But even if that's true, two levels analysis. Firstly, working environment improves, as I mentioned in the rebuttal earlier. Working environment is going to improve anyways, as I mentioned, as I analyzed in the earlier rebuttal. Secondly, we believe that competition goes up, and then the market, because of the market, expands. So even the developing nations are going to benefit from this policy as a whole. Therefore, what we have told you, what we're trying to stress here today as a speaker, as the closing government side, we're going to reach the goal of efficient distribution of human resources by actually giving both developing nations and developed nations what they actually need, and therefore really maximizing the efficiency in the global society. Thank you.
I guess the whole government team is living in a happy nirvana where things that they think should happen must happen because they should. But we think that if their proposal of linking FTA and free labor is going to succeed, it needs to have convincing power to the major parties of the people who are actually going to say yes or no within domestic and international arena. And the major flaw coming from opening government is basically your response to, steel industry losing or important industry within the country losing, right? You're happy to accept that, steel industry or really important base industry of the countries are actually going to lose competitive power. We think that in and of itself makes your proposal lose any possibility of convincing and being realized in the first place, and that actually is going to revert back to trend of free trade that are existing in many countries that I'm going to actually talk about in my second extension. So the extensions coming from closing oppositions is going to be basically two. We're going to specifically, graphically, talk about not just economic harms, but physical and real harms that are actually going to happen in cities, in actually over-urbanization. They're so problematic already in the status quo, but already really going to be problematic on the Euro model. But let me deal with some three issues first. Firstly, about minimum wage, right? Like in the status quo, what's happening in South Korea and many countries is they accept, for example, Southeast Asian workers, but they pay less than the minimum wage. And that is the reason why a lot of Korean people, even when they want to work or lose jobs in the status quo, because they're willing, because Southeast Asian workers or other workers from other countries are willing to pay much for less. So your minimum wage argument doesn't stand. Secondly, about anti-sentiment coming from opening opposition, we're actually going to build on that, actually much more strongly in the aspect of the physical factor of cities, and actually giving you the link on how anti-sentiment actually happens.
Where you go?
And let me try to deal with the closing government. This is interesting, right? So intellectual labor is going to be very, very beneficial, so we need to have free labor. First of all, Mr. Speaker, the number of people who are actually going to have for intellectual jobs are really, really small anyway. And we do have regulations, we do have systems of attracting people who are smart enough to come into our country in the status quo anyway, right? But the reason why we're going to need a lot of mechanisms to control is because these guys are lawyers, these guys are doctors, these guys are bankers, right? And the reason why we need a system of control, first of all, is because we have this different industry standards from China and Korea, for example. They have different laws, they have different health standards. I mean, let me be really, really frank. I don't want to go to a Chinese doctor tomorrow and he's not going to succeed in this particular country because we are going to have different understandings of what medical science is. We think that you're saying that we need to open up this free labor universe of nirvana because of that reason. It's simply going to fall. And you need to also explain to me why the status quo mechanism in attracting intellectual labor all across is not enough. We think it's enough. But it's going to need a lot of mechanism of regulation because these people are smart, these people have a lot of resources, have friends, bankers could possibly embezzle money, or there's a possibility of controlling them. That is why the status quo model of controlling them is perfectly fine and possible within the status quo. Let me deal with the...
Where you go?
Yeah.
Yeah, but if businesses have to compete for workers, including medical or whatever, under fair and equal standards, rather than getting a protected supply of cheap labor, doesn't that benefit the businesses that are actually able to compete better and more efficiently without the protection?
And especially because of that factor of cheap labor, right? And especially because the fact that there is going to be influx of people who are actually coming into Korea, for example, to looking for higher wages, is going to be highly problematic in my first extension of over-urbanization. Mr. Speaker, we think that, for example, my main characterization throughout my extensions are going to be China-Korea FTAs, right? So, if the deal is actually going to be made, right, it's going to be really, really lucrative for Chinese workers to come in millions and thousands because the deal that they oppose, the deal they have is actually too good for them, right? So, let's just review. There's no number control, there's no visa, there's no background check. There's only, in addition, you're going to give them healthcare, you're going to give them benefits that actually require citizenship or taxpayer money, right? So with absence of that, you actually want to accept millions and billions of Chinese people coming into Korea, and actually creates a number of problems in the status quo. For example, city of Seoul to start with, right? There's going to be language problem, traffic problem, water problem, beggars on the streets. Just imagine that you go on the second line subway tomorrow morning to go to your work, and then you see twice more people. That is going to create chaos under no system or possibility of control, right? So even if I accept like Peter's thing that you can only come when you have one particular job, right? There is always going to be a possibility of illicit companies or illicit contracts that attract people coming in. And there's actually status quo in many countries. In South Korea, for example, right? A lot of South Asian workers come into Korea without actually having legal contract or having legal contract on paper, and that creates a lot of problems for control and management and regulations is down. So because of that, we think that there's going to be even harsher illicit activities simply because we don't have background check. There's going to be much more a nightmare of legality, because what they do if they come in and commit crimes within our land, we simply cannot prosecute them or have them on our control. So they have more possibility of committing a crime, getting away with it. But then even when they do, there's going to be a legal nightmare of extradition and so forth, which actually creates really big problems for city environment in general. So secondly, let me explain to you why this particular model actually creates a trend against free trade in the long term. So first of all, free trade is a gradual process, right? No country in the world has your model of actually giving signing out subsidies, signing out like benefits of citizenship to people, to labor people who actually come. That is the reason why we actually have gradual process of free trade first, labor movement much later. But the reason why people are going to oppose that there's going to be a high public opposition, there's going to be a state very sensitive about these particular things, and that is the reason why your proposal that actually equates free trade with free labor is going to be seen as a force against society, and people will now, under your model, even if it doesn't happen, people now have the perception of actually going against free trade agreement in general, and that is why in the world we actually move back toward in terms of free trade, and that is why closing opposition takes it to that. Thank you.
At the end of the day, I would like to inform you and clarify you about what the purpose of FTA is and what we're trying to achieve at the very end of the day through this free labor movement. So what is the purpose of free trade agreement? We think that this is going to provide as much benefit as possible to all nations around the world. We're trying to promote a very positive impact by promoting and maximizing efficient distribution, by filling and providing what each nation needs. Because trade, what it means by trade is having when there is a lack of resources, they have to import it, and when there is surpluses, they can export it, and that's how in the globalized context. We think that in the context of globalization, it is very important to enjoy these benefits by trading and free trading, Mr. Speaker. So, moving on to several rebuttals. Before moving on to it, I would like to clarify some of the points that the opening opposition and closing opposition have mentioned, Mr. Speaker. They are continuously talking about the fact that there will going to be a severe competition regarding job market. We don't think that this is going to actually happen in specifically South Korean market, Mr. Speaker. Why is this so? We think that when it comes to South Korean market, if we see many of Korean people, almost the majority of people graduated college, right? That means that they're searching for specific jobs that they can benefit themselves, Mr. Speaker. This means that they majorly search for jobs that they can benefit them, like the first or second industry jobs and service jobs which can benefit them. So when it comes to job competition, we think that there won't going to be severe competition in 3D jobs because the majority of people who have graduated from college wouldn't want those kind of jobs, and this is the reason why we clearly mentioned that job competition will not occur at the end of the day, Ms. Speaker. So moving on to several rebuttals, I would like to talk about why specifically labor in this context is so important, Mr. Speaker. When it comes to trading, labor is very important because the individual itself is going to another country and somebody is coming in, right? When we characterize labor, it is very important because when it is quite different from technologies or products itself because it can influence in various perspectives, Mr. Speaker. For example, it can impact socially by going into other countries, and secondly, it can impact economically by as we have mentioned, maybe in our context, it can impact positively to economy, and I will going to move on and elaborate this on my questions, Mr. Speaker. So when we think about labor and characterizing labor, we think that the only team that have characterized the importance of labor and the importance of free trade agreement goal is our team, Mr. Speaker. So moving on to the several questions, I would like to first talk about from the perspective of laborers from developing countries, and second, I would like to talk about the fact about the problem of severe competition in job market, and third, I would like to talk about how developing nations as well will benefit from this. Developing and developed nations will benefit from this policy, Mr. Speaker. So to elaborate on cheap laborers or from the developing nation, I'd like to clarify that OO has not been saying that there will be heated competition in job market, which is not eventually going to happen in specifically South Korea, Mr. Speaker. So as a member of government, my teammate has mentioned that first, company will endeavor to survive in the competition with other companies as well, because as a company, they're profit-oriented. They want to make as much profit as possible. They want to allure as much cheap labor as possible. This, in other words, means that they're going to improve their welfare as well as insurance and as well as payments. When they have mentioned that payment will go low, yes, payment might get low in a very objective manner, but this is not going to occur in a relative manner because they have to compete. They will endeavor to not even payments, but also welfare and insurances should be improved in order to survive from that competition, Mr. Speaker. And cheap labor as well, as an immigrant from developing country, must have made important decisions. This is a very critical decision for their life, dying and living issue. So we think that this is giving a better, a broad, or better selection of choices, as my member have mentioned, because, as I have mentioned, the deterioration of payments or improvement in job environment will not occur at the end of the day, Mr. Speaker. We think that this is giving the most, the better or improving the working environment and giving the more selections of choices to individuals who are trying to get into a job market in developed nations. So we think that this is not going to harm any of the immigrants from the developing nations, Mr. Speaker. Moving on to my second class, I would like to talk about the severe problem of job competition. As I have mentioned in my rebuttal, we think that sending money back to the country of developing nations will not be very detrimental at the end of the day. Why? Why is this so? Because even if this is the case, comparatively the contribution of the cheap labor to a developed nation is very immense, Mr. Speaker. We think that when it comes to cheap labor, as I have mentioned previously and continuously, the contribution of cheap labor is immense from the developing nations. So we think that when there is a vacuum of 3D job market, we think that rather the developing nations' laborers are helping our economy and sustaining our economy. So we think that the contribution of cheap labor to our economy is more immense when they want to only say about they're going to send back money. That is a very minor issue when it comes to dealing with these problems, Mr. Speaker. Moving on to my third class, I will talk about that. My member have already mentioned the benefits of developing and both developed nations' benefits, when they have never engaged with us by saying that there is not going to be any, the status quo is fine. We think that when it comes to the benefits, especially in the developing nation, as I mentioned, when it comes to labor, it means that a human being is going there, and that resource is very valuable in the case that they have a special characteristic compared to other products or technologies that goes beyond that when they're exported. We think that they have a great impact and great improvements when they are exported and when they're actively traded in the global context. So when we think about this, developing nation will benefit at the end of the day. And secondly, as I previously mentioned, developed nations will actually gain benefit even though they might send some money back to their own country because the 3D laborers are lacking and there's a vacuum in job market, Mr. Speaker. So all we have to do today, at the very end of the day, we think that we're trying to achieve the goal of active and very a vivid trade and enjoy a very harmonious global market. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Call upon the last for this debate.
when you look at the entire debate, the question you have to ask yourself is not is there benefits in the long term, but who does it benefit in the long term? If you look at the entire debate, you see that the entire government bench ends up benefiting the rich. And I'm going to show you why that contradicts the very theme from the Prime Minister onwards of this motion. So you have a Prime Minister that says, under the context of cooperation is good and globalization is good and everything is great and there's limitations of labor, so we have to get rid of it. Why? She says, why do we have to get rid of the limitation of labor? The reason why is that only 1% benefit in this world where there is a limitation of labor. So she says that the rich benefit from the status quo. And she says that we want more competition, we want efficiency. So at the end of the day, they talk about how it only benefits the rich. But if you listen speaker to speaker to speaker to speaker on the entire government bench, they only focus on the rich and how it benefits rich people in poor countries moving towards labor where there's higher minimum wage in richer countries. Now the only example that they really give in opening government was Silicon Valley, a specific industry of well-educated and rich people that in a state, California, that has one of the highest GDP, the state of California has a GDP higher than certain countries. So what about the country as a whole? They don't talk about the poor within the United States. They don't talk about how this affects the poor. Their only argument, or the only example from the Prime Minister was, why don't we pick a rich place, a rich state with a rich industry and just talk about that, when our entire case and our entire stance is helping the poor and helping everybody in globalization. Then she goes on to say, quote unquote, I quote her, only countries who want to be a part of this need to pass this sort of motion. All right, that's quite a soft stance. So what if a country doesn't want this? They can't have it both ways. So then the Deputy Prime Minister comes up here and says, well, you know what? We don't have to prove that this will actually happen or this will, that we must pass this as a policy debate. We only need to prove that it's going to work in the long run. Okay, so basically you have a Deputy Prime Minister saying we don't have to prove it'll work, we just have to prove that it'll happen in the long term, and yet all of their interest and stance goes against helping the poor. They only talk about the rich. Let's say the Prime Minister didn't say this. Let's say the Prime Minister didn't do a soft stance. Okay, what are the benefits in the long term? So again, you have to focus on all the examples coming from the government bench. It was all about skilled labor. None of it was unskilled labor. So not only was their stance and emotion really soft and contradictory, not only can they not have it both ways, not only should not advocate for the poor, but only focus on the rich. They also talked about the EU, the Schengen Agreement, the US, and all these other things. One, the EU is falling apart, so free trade isn't even working there. Nevertheless, Schengen Agreement and labor, okay, the UK, part of the EU, has recently decided to put a quota on Romanian workers because they don't want an influx of labor that's happening now, of all the problems that the opposition bench has already explained to you. So, the EU doesn't work, these things don't work, none of this works, and it contradicts the entire side. Then, sorry, I have a lot I want to say.
Before you go.
No. I'll just say it right up front. I can't be bothered, so I'm not taking any POIs this speech. Not only do they contradict the stance, then the Deputy Prime Minister goes very theoretical and talks about comparative advantage, U.S. farming, okay? U.S. farming doesn't have anything to do with comparative advantage. His entire stance is comparative advantage. Yes, yet the U.S. farming industry is heavily subsidized. There's way too many crops with U.S. farming industry. So what do U.S. farmers do? They end up destroying more crops than they need to in order to keep world prices up. And what happens when you keep world prices up? You end up hurting the poor. So there's global poverty today, and yet they're talking about comparative advantage. And a rich country that subsidizes its own farmers starves the rest of the world and destroys crops that it can easily feed to other people. So again, it doesn't go with their whole stance that we don't want to just help the rich and the 1%. We want to help everyone. That is a load of BS. So we think that the opening government had already lost the debate. Then we have this brilliant member of government that did you not hear me? I'm not taking any of your words. She's a brilliant member of government who goes even more economic. She talks about efficient distribution and resources. I love economic framing, as if people and jobs and their livelihoods and where their next meal is going to come from doesn't matter, because all that matters is beautiful theory like comparative advantage. That didn't even work with their farming, heavily subsidized example. With Silicon Valley, doesn't even apply to the poor. So you have a member of government that didn't add anything new, and she forgot her entire case was about, again, movement of labor, but she forgot one thing. She forgot about infrastructure and national security. So So when the member of government was talking about how there'll be a certain input and output and surplus and everything else, okay, the closing opposition bench, they forgot that with infrastructure and national security, you're not going to have a perfect theoretical input and output, and population is going to evenly, distribute itself around the globe. Nobody's going to go to war-torn countries like Somalia and think, wow, I'm a budding lawyer, I'm a great doctor, I can make loads of money in Somalia. No, nobody's going to go, wow, I'm this amazing fashion designer. Why don't I go to Iraq, okay? No, unless you're part of the military-industrial complex where you can make a lot of money off shady deals, you're not going to go to Iraq, you're not going to go to Somalia, you're not going to go to Afghanistan. And even then, if you decide not to go to war-torn countries, let's say you go to a poor country like Indonesia, okay? The minimum wage is lower than the minimum wage in the UK. So if I'm a worker in a poor country, where am I going to go to? Well, I'm a lawyer. Where do I want to go? Do I want to get minimum wage in Indonesia? Or do I want to get minimum wage in Jakarta? I think I'm going to go to Jakarta. No. So you're going to get poor, unskilled labor. That's not going to go to Jakarta. They're going to probably go to Seoul, as closing opposition has told you. You're going to get overcrowding, over-urbanization, our entire extension. We're not going to go to Indonesia or Somalia or Iraq. We're going to tend to go to New York. We're going to go to London. We're going to go to Seoul. We're going to go to Tokyo. For all these reasons, we say that unless you can prove that infrastructure and over-urbanization isn't going to work, the entire government bench has failed. So you have an entire government side that says, we're not talking about 3D workers, we want intellectual labor, skilled labor. Well, you know what? We don't care about just the rich. The opposition side cares about the poor, and we don't just think about theory and input and output and economic efficiency. It's going to all distribute itself magically, because that's what I read in a comparative theory textbook on economics. We care about reality and what over-urbanization is going to do. Now, I'm glad that the government side is very profit-oriented, but again, you